Welcome to Blueprints for Liberty, Designing the Freedom Cities of Tomorrow. This is a podcast that explores the visionary concept of freedom cities and how we can create living environments that prioritize individual liberty, social harmony, and equal opportunities for all. We look back through history to see how the past informs the future and how people can self-organize in their communities to support self-sufficiency. We also look to develop leaders that are moral and ethical in a world that is spinning out of control. Tune in to be part of the conversation shaping the future of our communities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am super excited to have Suzanne Munson. She has written a book called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. This is a really interesting read. It's really short and sweet, but there's a lot of really good information in there about Thomas Jefferson. And I was excited when I saw her profile and wanted to interview her. So she graciously accepted, which I fully appreciate, and I'll give her a few minutes to introduce herself and her book. It's a slightly different take than I think most people are used to, and there's going to be some people, I'm sure, who will either agree or disagree, but that's okay, because to me, that's what the world's all about, is we don't all have to agree on everything, but opening our minds and looking at things through a different perspective can be an interesting way of expanding our horizons. So, Suzanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Cheryl. Thanks for the invitation. Fun to talk to you. A fellow Virginian.
Yes.
Well, you began with talking about my second book, which is The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And so I'd like to say that I write in two genres. One is traditional history. My first book was about Jefferson's mentor, outstanding founding father, George Wythe. And that book is called Jefferson's Godfather. And for that, I used only what all historians use, and that is physical evidence, letters, reports, other biographies, and so on, anything I could get my hands on that was written about this founding father and about Thomas Jefferson's youth. So that book was about Thomas Jefferson's youth, traditional history. So I was on really two paths at that time. My husband died in 2013. I had retired from what I call the downtown world. And so I've always written as part of my various careers, but I never had time to write my own stuff. So I was on a parallel journey. I was writing this first book of traditional history. And then when my husband died, I began a kind of a metaphysical path. And after he died, I would go outside and I would say, where are you? I'm not hearing anything. Some people get signs from their departed, but I'm not hearing anything, just crickets at night. And so that went on for a while. And then I went to a writer's retreat at Nimrod Hall in Bath County, a wonderful place. And I met an amateur medium there who was an author and a poet. And she had written a book called Friends in High Places, which I thought was kind of a cute title, because in addition to be, a very grounded personality, she also deals with the spirit world. So all this was new to me. And so I said, well, Katie, do you channel people? She said, yeah, I can. And, I don't charge for it. I just taught myself how to do it. So I thought that was really interesting. So I said, this was 6 months after my husband died. So I said, could you channel my husband? And she said, yeah, probably. What's his name? And she had a yellow notepad and she went in her room and she came out about a half hour later and described him perfectly. And I had never talked to her about my husband. She didn't know anything about him. So that began my metaphysical journey. Not long after that, I attended a meeting of IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We meet once a month here in Richmond, Virginia. And that was founded by astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who had sort of an epiphany coming back from the moon. And his new mission in life was to form an organization that would bridge science with spirituality, trying to use scientific principles to prove certain spiritual principles. So in one of those meetings of IONS, there was an author who had written a book of readings by a medium and conversations with Jerry and others I thought who had died. And the book won a number of awards. And so I looked at the medium that the author had worked with, and I thought, well, if she's good enough for this book, maybe I'll give her a call and maybe she can connect me with my late husband. So she lives in Indiana. I live in Virginia. And she has a website. Her name is Jana Anna. She's very sweet and is a healer. And so I asked to speak to my husband, and I believe he came through. There were little sayings that she, from her perspective, could never have come up with that were part of his vernacular. And a lot of other disclosures about family and what various family members were doing. So I was fascinated by that, and I went on to ask her to channel my parents and various friends who had departed, and I felt that I was getting something authentic coming through. So after a while, I thought, and I had published this book about Thomas Jefferson's youth with his mentor, and I thought, well, if I can talk to regular people, why can't I talk to somebody famous? And, why not Thomas Jefferson? And would he be too busy or too smart, to talk to me? Or would he think that I was just bothering him in the spirit world, wherever he is, whatever he's doing? So I contacted the medium, and I didn't tell her who I wanted to access. Didn't want to give her any time to prepare. And so she said, "What do you want to do today?" And I said, "I want to talk to Thomas Jefferson." Well, I had previously asked her if she had channeled historic figures, and she said she had, and she had done so for some writers. I'm not sure exactly what other books might have been involved. This is a new genre, is speaking with historic spirits. But anyway, so she paused a little bit and brought in an entity that said he was Thomas Jefferson. And so I said, tried to be very respectful. And I said, I have an idea for a book of your current views from where you are of how our government has evolved and what's going on in Washington and in our major institutions and in our universities, our media, our military, our foreign policy, all those things. And so I said, would you be interested in working with me on this project? And he said, I think that your heart is in the right place. In other words, I wasn't doing this to make a ton of money. I didn't expect to do that. But I did want to put a different perspective on what's going on today from the words of a founding father who was instrumental in giving us our democratic republic and what he might think of what's going on today. So simultaneously, I went on Amazon and I found 8 living authors who had written recent Jefferson books. And I got their emails. Most of them were attached to a university of some sort. And so I emailed them, and I didn't tell them what I was really doing. I said, of course, they would never have cooperated with me. But I said, I have taught classes on Thomas Jefferson and his youth and so on. And so I have a question that might be part of a class project. And that is, if you could talk to Thomas Jefferson today, what questions would you ask? So 8 very kindly authors, not knowing what they were involved with, gave me excellent questions to ask Jefferson. So I used all of those as well as my own. But I was really glad that I had asked these guys to participate, because some of those questions I wouldn't have had myself. So I had 8 sessions by phone with an entity presenting as Thomas Jefferson. And I just would type very furiously on my laptop, but I would get a recording. I wouldn't rely on my own notes. I got recordings of each session. And so I would go through each recording many, many times to make sure that I had every word that was correct that came through. And so I ended up with a good book, I think, a short book, but it hits a lot of hot buttons for today. And so it's had a good response. It's got pretty good ratings on Amazon. It's been out a couple of years. I was giving lectures on the book, but I stopped doing that because half of the class loved the lecture and the other half thought it was crazy. So I kind of keep my mouth shut about my metaphysical journeys. But I do like to talk to people like you on podcasts because I think you are open-minded, and I think people who listen to you are open-minded. So that's really what I do now to talk about my book. I don't teach classes anymore.
Well, it's interesting because I think, talking about the metaphysical and in general, I tell people if you would have even asked me probably a year or two ago, about such things, it's not that I didn't believe that they didn't happen, that these types of experiences weren't available to us. Or, when we start talking about like astrology, we think of, well, I'm old enough that we open a newspaper, I'm a Cancer, I read my horoscope, that was my idea of what astrology was, and all of these things that are esoteric, kind of ethereal kind of things. But this is a little bit unrelated, but I think the first time that I really, and I consider myself a very religious and spiritual person who feels like when I pray, I communicate with God. And I think, oh, well, if I can communicate with God, why is it such a leap of faith to think I couldn't communicate with other people who aren't in my physical presence, And so that was kind of a little bit of an eye-opening experience for me, but this is going to sound a little off topic, but it really isn't. In 2017, I think it was, my husband and I went to a family reunion in Jackson, Wyoming, and my family has a cabin up there. And my husband was super excited to go to the solar eclipse. And I was like, whatever, I was willing to tag along. And the cabin was probably an hour away from where you could get 100% totality. And all of my family, except for me and my husband, and I think my daughter, I'm not totally sure, I don't remember, but they were fine staying at the cabin and getting 99% totality. And my husband's like, no, we're going the extra hour. We are going to drive the extra hour. And I'm like, well, okay, whatever. I was just like, I'm along for the ride. I don't care. We got there and, got situated. We were in this valley, lots of, it's Jackson, Wyoming. So there's lots of really high mountains and things around us. Very, very beautiful valley, but there were cows and, various animals. There were quite a few people who drove into that valley, but, it wasn't overcrowded by any means. And I remember as the sun, moon, or whatever was blocking whatever, the sun was being blocked. It was interesting. And, you felt the temperature drop, you felt it get darker. It was interesting. And, we got to about 99% totality, and it was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But when it hit 100% totality, I was like, oh, this is really a different experience. And you can't even explain it. It's just something you have to experience. And I mean, like the cows they didn't moo at 99% totality, and they didn't moo on the other end when it was, past totality and, 99% the other side. They mooed when it was 100% totality. And of course the crickets came out, and there was like this energy in the air. I just couldn't explain it. I was like, wow, this is amazing. It's like, oh, this is interesting, And then, we went on about our life. And then this last 2024, we went to Cleveland this year, where we could witness totality. And once again, it was an extremely interesting experience. And there was a lot more people there, obviously. We got fortunate enough to sit right on the banks of one of the Great Lakes. Can't remember exactly which one it is, right there in Cleveland. but it was just, it's just an energy. And that's, I guess, was the first time I really started understanding that there were these energy fields around me, and that for whatever reason, I just wasn't experiencing them. And so I started looking into this a whole lot more, and trying to understand a little bit more about these energy fields. And then I joined this mastermind, and a gentleman there turned me on to the idea of conscious leadership. And I was like, oh, is that kind of like servant leadership? He's no. I was like, quiet leadership, kind of being empathetic and, being in tune with the people around you, kind of thing. And he's like, no. And I'm like, well, what is this conscious leadership? He goes, you're just gonna have to kind of go figure it out yourself. And so in my journey of trying to understand human consciousness more and more, I've been really opening my mind to a lot more of these ideas that I, even a couple of years ago, might not have been willing to open my mind to. And I think that's why your book captured me. Number one, I'm an avid lover of history. I love Thomas Jefferson. And if I could talk to Thomas Jefferson, I would be like, okay. So, all the questions that you ask him were questions I would have asked him, and things like that. I thought, oh, this sounds really interesting. So if you don't mind just kind of going a little bit through, in the very beginning of your book, you talk about quantum physics and human consciousness. Talk about that just a little bit, and we'll go from there. Is that okay?
Yeah, you're really onto something about the different energy fields. And in my journey studying human consciousness, the evolution of human consciousness, I began with, I think, the breakthrough decade in the Western Hemisphere for all this was the 70s, with the first two books that I think are the most important. One was written by a University of Virginia doctor. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody. It is a worldwide sensation, 13 million copies sold. And so we have what I've learned from the near-death experience, which is what Dr. Moody studied. He studied only 100 cases of people who, say, were on the operating table and had a clinical death, no brain action, no heart action, no action whatsoever, and left their bodies and had an out-of-body experience and came back sometime later to tell about what they had experienced. And so that is called the near-death experience. So one explanation for that, if you want to get into energy levels, is that physicists have discovered in the 20th and 21st century that everything in the universe is connected at the smallest level that we have discovered. We're all linked in an energy field. It's a vast energy field. And rocks have energy. Their energy is dense. Trees are a little less dense. The human body is dense. It has dense energy. But the part of us that animates the body is of a much lighter energy. And that is the energy that survives physical death. And you can call it, I don't like to call it soul because, that's kind of a religious term, or spirit or whatever. So the scientific term, or the commonly used term now by scientists, is human consciousness, is consciousness. That is the part that is eternal, that leaves the dense matter. One thing some of these near-death experiencers say when they leave their bodies and look down on their pitiful little bodies on the operating table, I say, what a mess. And they say, oh, that's my meat body. That's not me. I'm still here. And what's going on? I thought I was down there. I thought I was my body. I'm not my body. Who am I? Where am I going? So there's a lot of perplexion right in the beginning. And then they all have common experiences. There are 4 or 5 common experiences. And so Dr. Moody's research of 100 people, 100 patients at the University of Virginia published in 1975, his studies have been replicated scores of times by other medical doctors, by psychiatrists, PhD researchers. And there are literally tens of thousands of near-death experience accounts out there where our higher energy leaves our dense energy and goes on to another dimension. They say that there's just a very thin veil between us and the other side, and those who've left this dimension and gone on to another dimension. There's a very thin veil between that, us. Now, me personally, I've never personally been able to penetrate that veil because I don't have the gift of mediumship. When we grew up in the 20th century, and a lot of people still in the 21st century, we were all taught that mediums are charlatans, that they prey on gullible people and they only want money. And that may have been true of some, maybe in the 19th century. I don't know. I think there's one bad word about them, psychics, in the Bible, but you have to take the times into account, because there were a lot of charlatans running around there, oracles and so on, who could, said they could predict the outcome of a war or how long you were going to live or whatever. Although I do think there were probably some authentic people as well, but there were a bunch of charlatans. So I think the Bible was warning people against the charlatans. But in the 21st century, mediums have come into their own. I think they're gaining respect. There was a cute little girl from Long Island who was the Long Island medium, who had a big following on TV for a number of years. And there have been many, many books by mediums about what they do and their readings. The brains of mediums have been studied at the university level, and they have different brain waves, and their brains are configured a little bit differently from ours. That, I think, may come from the practice that they have opening the portal between this dimension and the other dimension. So there are only 3 ways of looking at my Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson book. The first is I wrote it. The second is the medium made it all up. And the third is that we're hearing from somebody who says he's Thomas Jefferson. There's only 3 ways of looking at it. Okay. Mm-hmm. Number 1, I have 8 hours of recordings still on my computer. I can send it to anybody. And they clearly show that I'm the one who's asking the questions. I am not providing the answers. Mm-hmm. Number 2, the medium majored in elementary education. She knew very little about Thomas Jefferson, except that he was president and wrote the Declaration of Independence. That's about all she knew. And she didn't know who Sally Hemings was, for example. And we had a little session about Sally Hemings. Well, of course, we had to do that. His alleged slave mistress. And then the third assumption is that we did talk to somebody who says he's Thomas Jefferson. So there's only 3 ways of looking at it. And I pretty much debunk the first 2. So I leave it open, have a willing suspension of disbelief. But even if you don't believe in the mediumship part of the book, I hope you will agree that it's worth reading, because Jefferson, what's in the book is what Jefferson would probably say if I were writing the book. Now, if I were writing the book, well, there's no way I could have written it because the ideas are not my own. But one thing I certainly wouldn't have done is use modern terminology. I would have been smart enough to know if I was faking it, to use 18th century lingo. But he's fully cognizant of what's going on today in the United States and elsewhere. And so when we were talking about universities and we started talking about university athletics, he used the term cash cow. Well, I wouldn't be stupid enough to put that in a book if I wrote it. That's a totally modern term. But he used it because apparently spirits don't just go float on a cloud and, play a harp. They are around and they're watching. And he says he roams the halls of Congress that once were sacred. And he's very disturbed about what's going on there. So he uses some other modern terminology like ego that was not used in his time. And so I have to explain that in the book, that I wrote down exactly what came through. And so it's an interesting book, even if you can't accept the mediumship part, it's still worth reading.
It is. And I think what I found most fascinating, not fascinating isn't probably the right word, but I'm also avid student of the Constitution. I wouldn't call myself a constitutional scholar by any means, but a lot of people will ask me, why go back to this old document? Why go back, the people who wrote it back then, the times were different, we need to be more modern in our thinking, and we have so many new challenges. And this didn't come from your book, but I'm sure you've heard the quote of Thomas Jefferson where like every 17 years we need to redo the Constitution or something because, times do change, there's no doubt. But, watching Supreme Court decisions, there's always the two schools of thought. There's the, strict constitutionalist side of things, and then there's the other side that, wants to kind of, I guess, modernize things and create or interpret laws based on our current, way of thinking and doing things. And as I was reading the book, it's clear that he, rightfully so, has a bias toward, their ways of thinking and doing. And I think it came across to me, and, not in an arrogant kind of way from him, that, they didn't just come up with these ideas. These weren't just, oh, this sounds great. And as he walked the halls of Congress and, the things you're talking about, he talks about these people with egos. He talks about people who are motivated by money. They're either get into this profession, and it shouldn't be a profession. It really should be a servant leadership type position, but, get into this profession with good intentions and then get corrupted by the system, or, just are purely power hungry and, don't even get into it for the right intentions. And that's something that we've all, I think, come to the conclusion. I interviewed somebody on my podcast not too long ago, and he was talking about how money has just all truly corrupted politics. We all know that. We all say that, but none of us are really willing to do what's necessary to step back and say, hey, we have the power to fix this. And I think that's kind of what came through is, they gave us the power. This was such a unique idea at the time. And even to this day, it's a unique idea that we, the people, have the power to fix things, to, to right the wrongs that have happened. And that's where I think, and I love the Constitution, but the Declaration of Independence, you ask him, well, if you could change something, it's like, well, I guess maybe, if I lived in the modern world, I wouldn't say all men are created equal. I'd say all people are created equal, kind of
Right.
thing.
Well, the funny thing about that was he said a lot of people are quibbling about those words now in the introduction. And that's not getting to the heart of the Declaration of Independence, the whole meat of it. And the medium said that he blew a raspberry about that.
I know. I laughed. I was like, oh, okay.
All this trivial criticism of, all men are created equal. Well, of course we can argue that one. But anyway, if he were rewriting it, he would say all people, all human beings, whatever.
And he talks about, how he wishes that we didn't have these biases, especially in his day, against, colored people, and how women, talks about his own family, how his father was demeaned women, and he didn't agree with that, and he didn't like that. I think the thing that I like is it makes these people human. It's like, there's a lot of things that are going on in the country and the world today that I don't like. But as one person, I don't necessarily feel like I'm in a position. I mean, certainly I want to do my part to effectuate that change, but I'm just one person. And I think he kind of, on some level, felt the same way. He knew he was onto something. He knew this was pretty profound, but he couldn't change the world overnight,
Right. Well, he did say that every country should have a revolution periodically, Of course, he did support the French Revolution, maybe a little longer than he should have after all the bloodletting took place. But so he does say in the book that we do need a new revolution in this country, but not of the bloody sort, not a physical uprising. He says that we need a revolution of integrity is what we need.
Yes.
in Washington and everywhere. And so I asked him, I said, well, you have all these criticisms of government today. I said, what would you do if, you were president of the United States today? And he said, well, I could do very little because I would not have a following for all of the reforms that I would want to make. He said, you first have to have a following. Can't do it by yourself. And of course, we have all these checks and balances now so that one person can't just sweep everything off the table. And so he said, I might start in Congress and I would try to gather around me a circle of integrity, people who had not been bought out by the system and by big money, who had not lost their principles, who are not feathering their nests to the extent that some of them do, who really do consider themselves servant leaders, public servants. And I know a few of those. I think my congresswoman here in Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, I think she's a genuine public servant. And there are people in Congress, I think the newer ones particularly, who do come in, wanting to serve the people. There are others who are just ideologues, who don't know anything about doing a budget or being objective about anything, or devoting their intellect to a subject, an issue, a problem. So he said that once the circle of integrity enlarges, then these reforms could be made, such as term limits. He said he really doesn't like the idea of term limits because if somebody's doing a wonderful job, they should be allowed to keep going. But the way the system is, the way people are being compromised by money and favors and having their egos stroked, it's better to have the term limits now. So yeah, there's a lot of that sort of thing in the book. And also one thing that really surprised me, one of the questions that came from one of the professors who had written another book about him was, who is the person who influenced you most in life? Well, I was fully expecting him to talk about the man that I wrote about, who I considered his greatest mentor and gave him his best ideas. In fact, the three things that Jefferson wanted on his tombstone, I can trace all those things back to his teacher, George Wythe. And I do so in my first book called Jefferson's Godfather. Anyway, I was a little disappointed that he said it wasn't George Wythe who had the greatest influence on him. I think they kind of sparred. I think they went back and forth with ideas, and they were good. It challenged each other's ideas. And he said that he needed challenging and he did say that about George Wythe, that Jefferson, of course, knew that he was very, very bright, and he would make declarations as a young man, as a college student, and put a period beside them. But his mentor would ask him a line of questions and maybe change his attitude about something. Anyway, so I was expecting George Wythe to come through as his greatest influencer, but he said, no, it was his mother. Well, I was under the assumption that he and his mother had a cool relationship, because I read this book called Founding Mothers or something. It was about all the mothers of the presidents from Washington on to current day. And so the authors couldn't find any praise that Jefferson had of his mother. He seemed distant. And when she died, he just had a note, sort of a passing note to somebody. I suppose you heard that my mother has died. Anyway, so the assumption was made that he didn't honor her. Anyway, so he said no, that she had a tremendous influence on him. She had mental issues, and she was from a very prominent family, the Randolphs, and they were known, some of them, to have some mental issues, a lot of inbreeding, first cousins marrying first cousins, so on. Anyway, he said she had some issues that could be treated today with medicine or therapy, but there was no treatment at the time. But that the gift that she gave him was that she would drop everything she was doing when he was speaking to her, and she would listen to him. She would look him in the eye. And he said just that bit of attention, that amount of attention from a parent, is priceless. No, he adored his father, but his father was gone a lot. He was a surveyor, and he died when Jefferson was 14. And so Jefferson was in great need of serious, good adult mentors at that time. And that is the beginning of my first book, Jefferson's Godfather, about his time in Williamsburg as a young college student and how he could easily have turned out not to be a great statesman. He could have just been a gentleman plantation owner and spent his time at cards and drinking and gossiping and so on.
Mhm.
And he acknowledges that in a letter that he wrote to a grandson, that he could have gone another way, but he chose to associate with older men of learning, scholars, men who were important to the future of the country, George Wythe being one of those. So lots of surprises in the book. I'm sure you found some as well.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And honestly, his mother was probably one of them. And I guess it's interesting because so many of his answers to the questions were things I think I would hope that he would have said, but it would have, so it didn't surprise me, I guess, because that's what I was hoping his answer would be. I was hoping he was a founding father who was really believed in the vision of what they were creating and recognizing that it truly was a unique and special thing. And I think, I'm not sure if it was in the book because I've read so much about Thomas Jefferson, it's hard for me to always distinguish where I read things. You know, he didn't serve in the military in terms of, you know, fighting in the war and things like that, which I think surprises a lot of people because we all think that our founding fathers were all these, you know, Samuel Adams type people, but he stayed in Virginia and he did. I mean, he absolutely had a passion for Virginia and it was his home. And, you know, obviously he spent the overwhelming majority of his time there, except for, you know, trips here and there to go other places, maybe Philadelphia and a few other places. So I don't know. I didn't feel like when I read it, there was anything earth shattering about it. Like, oh, wow, he said something that just totally caught me off guard. I found it more reassuring and more of a, okay. And as I read it, it, in my mind, made me better appreciate the medium, because it's like, okay, this is weird, because if this is something I would have expected him to say, then I would have expected the medium to say it through him. You know what I mean? And have already known that information. But yet it's, I guess I'll leave it a little open-ended so that people will want to read it and they can come to their own conclusion. But yet know that my conclusion was that it was real. And like I said, there wasn't anything earth-shattering that made me recognize that it was real. It was just more of a reassurance that it was real.
Right. His talents were not in the military arena.
Mhm,
His talents were in government.
mhm,
And so during the war, he was wartime governor of Virginia.
mhm.
And Virginia, even though we weren't even close to winning the Revolutionary War, in fact, it looked dismal for the most part until the French came in to help us. And so he had to flee for his life when the British came after him as governor of Virginia. He just barely escaped from Monticello just hours before they came to nab him. And he would have had a quick and bitter end, I'm sure. So again, government was his talent, and he wrote about it. He was a prolific writer, and there was letters between him and George Wythe, the man I wrote about what formed the government, and also between John Adams and George Wythe. What shape should the government have? Should you have, you know, two legislative bodies, the Senate and Congress? And how often should people be elected? How should judges be chosen? They went through the whole gamut very carefully. And Virginia, even before Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was published July 4th, back in June, Virginia was already acting as if it was an independent little country. And, they were writing their own constitution, which was very similar to the one that eventually we adopted, their own Declaration of Rights. They were redoing the court system, the only Institute of Higher Learning, William and Mary. They couldn't wait to reform that because even though it was a very old college, second oldest in America after Harvard, it needed reforming because most of the faculty were disgruntled clergymen from England, not particularly inspiring. So Jefferson appointed the man I wrote about, George Wythe, to be America's first law professor. And he, in his 10 years as America's first law professor, trained 200 of our best leaders at the state and national level. So part of what I write about is the power of one. Now, one thing that did surprise me a little bit when we get into Jefferson's wish for this country, a great wish of his, of course, was religious freedom. And that's one of the 3 achievements that he lists on his tombstone. Number 1 is author of the Declaration of Independence. Number 2, author of the statute of Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was later incorporated in the First Amendment. And number 3, father of the University of Virginia. And he didn't list president, he didn't list foreign ambassador, didn't list any of that, governor. He only wanted achievements that he thought benefited mankind on his tombstone. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I felt that it was very comforting, was what he said in the chapter on religion. Now, he was thought to be an irreligious person in his day. And he did not like organized religion. He had seen its corruption as ambassador to France. He toured Europe and lived in France. And it was in the 18th century there's still a great deal of corruption in the established churches over there. And, a lot of it was about power and greed, as opposed to taking care of the common people and love and kindness and generosity. A lot of it was about judgment and power and greed. And he sees that in some of today's religious institutions that are about judgment, money, power. And so I asked him about Jesus, and he said that Jesus, he had encountered his spirit, and that he is real for real. But he has withdrawn his spirit from some of these churches that are no longer really teaching Christianity, but have kind of gone off on a tangent. And religious freedom was extremely important to him because the people in Europe were not free, although there had been the Reformation and there were, some Protestant sects in various countries. I think they still had a government-supported church in France where he was. And even in Virginia, people like Patrick Henry felt that we were all going to go to perdition unless we had an established church that we all gave our money to, and we were all taxed to support. Well, that church happened to be the Church of the Establishment, which was the former Church of England. And then that became disestablished and became eventually the Episcopal Church. Well, that was the church of the elite, because the Protestant people who were breaking out of that mold were not the old Tidewater plantation people, the old power structure. They were other people with different ideas. The power structure wanted their religion to be dominant, and they wanted everybody to pay taxes for it. Well, those were the things that Jefferson opposed. No taxes for any religion. People should find their own way. And that was very important to him.
Yeah, I've done some research. I was doing a presentation down in Lynchburg on the First Amendment. And the First Amendment wasn't always the First Amendment. There was actually an amendment before the First Amendment that didn't go through. But what I think most people don't recognize is, because when we say religion, we always think of organized religion. We think of people, organizing into a group of people and, attending a specific church and paying your tithes, your money to that church, whether it be a state-run church or just, your local community church. But originally, the original wording was not freedom of religion, it was freedom of conscience. And, that just eliminates the whole idea of organized religion. It just means that you're allowed to think and believe the way you want to think and believe. And whether that involves organized religion or not, or whether that involves Christianity or some other Eastern religion or Islam or whatever religion. And I think when people understand that that's really what the founding fathers were thinking when they put together the Bill of Rights, was this freedom of conscience. And I can't exactly remember how they landed on the word religion and decided to use the word religion. It wasn't the original, and it was predominantly, the conversation was around not consciousness, but your right to believe the way you want to believe. And when you really dig into the first, I'm always like, okay, why does the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights have, all of these different things, where the other ones are very specific to one topic? But really, they're all very interrelated. And the reason that it did become the First Amendment, because they felt it was so important that you be able to think, speak, write, how you feel, and that you could gather together and peaceably assemble, and all of these things are surround that one fundamental right. Because if you don't have that one fundamental right, nothing else really matters. And that's why they were so adamant that it be the first, and that they encompass and specify, think, read, write, all of that.
That's
And
right.
And so when, you read about Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers who were deists, or they didn't believe in this religion, or they didn't believe, they didn't, because they really believed that they, in their heart, believed that was fundamentally the most important thing, freedom you could actually have.
Yeah. Well, Jefferson in his later years had a project that's today called the Jefferson Bible.
Mhm.
And he was a big fan of Jesus, of the teachings of Jesus.
Mhm.
And so what he did was, because he was fluent in different languages, he took the different versions of the Bible, Latin, Greek, a couple of modern languages, Hebrew, and he did a cut and paste job of the four Gospels, because he didn't want anything written by anybody other than Jesus, or said by anybody other than Jesus, just the simple teachings of Jesus. And so he took out some things from the Gospels, like the miracles. He wasn't quite sure about the miracles. Maybe was that superstition, or what was that? And just got down to the basic teachings of love and compassion and forgiveness. And so he published the Bible. He didn't call it the Bible. He called it the Life and Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, or something like that. Anyway, if you want to read it, it's up on Amazon. It's called the Jefferson Bible. And I have a copy. But the fact is, even though he probably didn't really relate too much to what was going on in church at the time, I don't know whether he went to church or not, but let's say he didn't, he still honored the teachings of Jesus Christ, and he still honored the being of Jesus Christ. So I think that's kind of been forgotten, but it's worth reading. I've got a copy of the Jefferson Bible. I read it.
Oh, yeah, a good idea. Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate your time today, and sharing your thoughts and ideas. And I highly recommend the book. Like, it is short and sweet and to the point, and I think it's very enlightening. And like I said, whether you choose to believe the metaphysical side of it, or just, find it interesting, I do believe it will expand your horizon a little bit, and hopefully give you a better understanding of, what Thomas Jefferson did believe, and possibly what he might believe, you know, looking at the world as it exists today. So,
Yes, it's called the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson,
Mhm.
and it's on Amazon, and it's pretty well rated.
Okay, yeah.
So,
And I'll have it in the show notes, link to it, so people can go
mhm.
ahead and do that. And there'll be more information about Suzanne and her life and her ventures, the things that she's doing in there too. So feel free to go through the show notes, and I encourage you to look at her other works, because if you're a student of history, I'm sure you'll thoroughly enjoy them. And I do think George Wythe is definitely a fascinating figure in and of himself, which we touched on but didn't talk about too much, because he's one of those people that I believe isn't even mentioned as a founding father oftentimes, but yet had a profound influence on them. So,
That's correct.
all righty. Well, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you, Cheryl.
All righty. We'll see you later.